Example 7. Establish the identity secant of x plus the tangent of x is equal to the cosine of x over 1 minus the sine of x. All right, I'm going to start by working with the left side, okay? I'm going to take the left side and try to turn it into the right side. So let's go ahead and write it down. Okay, so we've got the secant of x plus the tangent of x. So I'm going to use basic trig identities plus algebraic manipulation, and I'm going to try to turn this into the right side of the equation, which is the cosine of x over 1 minus the sine of x. Okay, I'm going to do this by converting everything to sines and cosines. Okay, we did that in example 6, and it worked great for us. We've done this before with other identities. It's a good tip to follow. Okay, all right, so if we try this here, secant of x is 1 over the cosine of x. And then we're going to add the tangent of x. Tangent of x is the sine of x over the cosine of x. And now we're left with two fractions that we're adding together, so we need a common denominator. And it's great because the fractions already have the same denominator. So our denominator is going to be cosine of x, and then to combine the numerators, we just need to add across the top. Okay, so we'll get 1 plus the sine of x. Okay, and at this point, you're kind of like, well, what do I do now? Okay, because look what you're trying to get. You're trying to get cosine of x over 1 minus the sine of x, okay? And you might think, okay, well, let me break the fraction up. So you take everything in the top, divide by the entire denominator, and at that point, you're just working in circles because that was this step, okay? So what's going on here, this is a situation where you start trying to establish an identity, you go with a technique, and you realize you're running in circles. It's not going to work out, okay? So we've got to try another approach. This is an identity. You're going to have to verify it somehow, okay? Turning the left side into sines and cosines does absolutely nothing for us, okay? So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to leave this here. I'm not going to erase it because I want you to remember that this happened, okay? I'm going to put a big X through it. This did not work out. This did not work out. Boo! Sad face. Okay, so we're going to try something else, okay? I'm going to start with the right side, the fraction, and try to achieve the left side, okay? So let me go ahead and write down the right side. So we've got the cosine of x over 1 minus the sine of x, okay? So again, we're going to work using basic trig identities, okay, and algebraic manipulation, and we're going to try to achieve the left side, which is the secant of x plus the tangent of x, okay? All right, so we're starting with a single fraction, okay? And what we've done with fractions so far is we've broken them down, taking a single fraction and broken it into multiple fractions. And the correct way to do that is to take every piece in the top and divide by the entire denominator. So if you did that here, you would take every piece in the top and divide by the entire denominator. You can't really break this fraction down. Okay, so again, you might feel stuck. Like, how in the world do I do this identity? Okay, all right, there is another tip that we have not tried yet. Okay, so if you go back through that tip list, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite the fraction. Okay, remember the good old conjugate that we talked about? Okay, we can multiply this fraction top and bottom by the conjugate of the denominator here. Okay, so remember, we're going to multiply the conjugate. What that is, you're going to keep this bottom pretty much the same as it is. You're going to have a 1 on the right, or sorry, a 1 on the left and a sine x on the right, okay? And you're going to change the sign in the middle. So the conjugate is 1 plus the sine of x instead of 1 minus the sine of x, okay? Again, all you do to form the conjugate is you keep the same term on the left, which is 1. You keep the same term on the right, which is the sine of x, and you simply change the sign in the middle. If the sign is negative, you change it to positive. If it's positive, you change it to negative, okay? So we're multiplying this original fraction by the conjugate, okay? We're multiplying it in the numerator, and we're multiplying it in the denominator. You have to do that, okay? You are essentially multiplying by some quantity over itself. 1 plus sine x over 1 plus sine x, that is 1, okay? So you're really multiplying the original fraction by 1, so you're not changing the original problem, okay? All right, so let's do that. Let's see what multiplying by the conjugate does for us, okay? We're multiplying two fractions, okay? So we need to multiply across the top and multiply across the bottom, okay? So in the numerator, I'm multiplying the cosine of x times 1 plus sine x is a package deal. It has two terms. So I have to put it in parentheses because later I may have to distribute that cosine of x and I need to distribute it to both pieces, okay? And then likewise in the bottom, when you multiply the quantities together, you have the package deal 1 minus sine x, so it needs to go in parentheses, times the other package deal 1 plus the sine of x. Both of those guys have to go in parentheses because they have two terms each. Okay, so we have multiplied across the top and we have multiplied across the bottom. Okay, all right, so let's see what happens here. Okay, I am going to go ahead, I'll go ahead and multiply out. Sometimes you should, it's questionable. You don't always have to multiply out everything. Sometimes it's in your best interest not to multiply out. And really, at this point, if you're just learning that, you don't know when you should or when you shouldn't multiply out. So just go ahead and multiply everything out, okay? And then if you have to go back and factor, then you just have to. The more practice you get with this, you'll pick up little things and you'll realize, okay, maybe I shouldn't multiply this part out, okay? So since you're just learning, let's go ahead and multiply everything out. Let's multiply out the numerator. So we're going to distribute the cosine of x through the parentheses. So we're going to get the cosine of x times 1, which is cosine of x, plus the cosine of x times the sine of x. Okay? In the bottom, you are going to have to FOIL. Okay? It is going to be, you got to do your first terms, your outer terms, your inner terms, your last terms. Okay? So we're going to do 1 times 1 is going to give us 1. And then we're going to do 1 times sine of x is going to give us plus sine x. Okay, then we're going to do the inner terms. Negative sine x times 1 is negative sine of x. And then the last terms, negative sine of x times positive sine of x, that's going to be negative sine squared x. Okay, so that's what happens when we multiply out. Okay, I'm going to clean this up. Okay, in the top, I have cosine of x plus cosine of x times sine x. In the bottom, look what happens. I see a positive sine x and a negative one. They cancel and leave me with 1 minus sine squared x. Okay? All right, so what this is, okay, we know the good old Pythagorean identity, okay? A sine squared x plus cosine squared x should give us 1, okay? So if we're trying to match up the quantity in the bottom, we need to subtract sine squared x from both sides, okay? That tells us that 1 minus the sine squared of x is equal to the cosine squared of x, okay? So this quantity is the same thing as cosine squared of x, okay? So in our next step, we're going to go ahead and make that replacement. I'm going to leave the numerator alone, and then I'm going to replace the bottom. 1 minus sine squared x is the same thing as the cosine squared of x, okay? All right, I am going to move to the next page because I'm running out of room. And before I do that, let's talk about what the next step should be. I am going to go ahead and break up this fraction. Okay, so I'm going to take every term in the top and divide by the entire denominator. Okay, so at the top of the next page, I'm going to write cosine of x divided by cosine squared of x. So cosine of x over the cosine squared of x. And then we need to keep the same sign in the middle, which is a plus. And then we're going to write the other term in the top, cosine of x times the sine of x, all divided by cosine squared of x. Okay, so we'll get plus cosine of x times the sine of x, all divided by the cosine squared of x. Okay, again, proper way to break up a fraction. Take every term in the top, divide by the entire denominator. Okay, All right, fraction on the left. This is really cosine of x over cosine of x times cosine of x. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and jot the same thing down for the fraction on the right. So we've got plus cosine of x times the sine of x. I'm just rewriting for both fractions here the fact that the cosine squared of x is just cosine of x times the cosine of x. You don't have to do that, okay, but I'm just trying to show you in case you don't see this, okay? So now if you look at the fraction on the left, there's a cosine x in the top, 1 in the bottom. So that's going to leave you with 1 in the numerator, cosine x in the bottom. Plus, if we look at the fraction on the right, we also have a cosine x in the top and 1 in the bottom. So we are left with sine x in the top, cosine x in the bottom, okay? And then our final step here, we hope, this should match the remaining side of the identity. 1 over the cosine of x is the same thing as the secant of x, plus sine of x over the cosine of x is the tangent of x, okay? And if we go back and look at the original identity, okay, we did get a match to the left-hand side, okay? We started with the right side, okay? We used our basic trig identities and algebraic manipulations, and we generated a sequence of expressions, equivalent expressions, and we finally, our last step produced secant of x plus tangent of x, okay? So we have verified this identity, okay? So make sure you understand from this example, okay? You may start an identity out some way and think, hey, this is going to get me there, and then you just crash and burn, okay? That doesn't mean you can't prove the identity. You've just got to try something else. Make sure you keep that tip list handy.